fight between KMT and the CCP resumed almost immediately after World War II ended. Although the KMT was vastly superior in resources before the war, it lost most of its lead due to the war. Meanwhile, the communist guerrillas who fought in the vast countryside behind the lines, where the Japanese army can hardly find, took advantage of this opportunity. Within a mere 4 years, the communists successfully defeated the nationalist army and founded the People's Republic. Although China emerged as victor of World War II, almost all of China's economy was destroyed, and the country faced mass shortage of food and materials. The KMT officials who regained control of the country from the surrendering Japanese forces proved to be corrupted and a burden to the country's economy. Meanwhile, the communist popular land reform policy at the vast countryside contrasted them as the one who truly cared about the people. As the KMT lost control of the countryside, where most of the population lived, the civil war began to turn in favor to the CCP. The communists were extremely successful in propaganda and portrayed themselves as standing with the people. The KMT, consisting mostly of the capitalist and government elites, only alienated the people more by resuming the civil war against the communists. The Chinese people were tired of fighting after more than 8 years of fighting the Japanese, and most sympathized with the CCP. The war turned against the KMT when it lost a few decisive battles between 1948 and 1949. Finally, in December 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government retreated to the island of Taiwan, the former Japanese colony that China just took back after World War II. The communists established the People's Republic of China in Beijing and proclaimed itself to be the successor state of the Republic of China. This would result in the so-called Taiwan problem today, which China asserts that Taiwan is a rebel province that it vows to ultimately reunify. The establishment of the PRC, the People's Republic, was a major blow to the West, as China, one of its largest allies, was lost to communism. The US administration, which during the Chinese Civil War had largely given up on the KMT, decided to halt communist advancement and back up Taiwan. In 1950, Communist North Korea invaded the South in an effort to reunify the Korean peninsula. The US quickly reacted by landing outside Seoul and nearly drove the North Koreans into China. China, fearing that the US' true intention was to invade China and bring Chiang Kai-shek back, decided to act preemptively and send a massive army to Korea to push the Americans back. Suffering tens of thousands of casualties, the Chinese successfully pushed the Americans back to South Korea. Although paying a heavy price, the Communist Party turned this into a massive propaganda success, as it was the first time that China defeated the strongest country in the world. To many, the Korean War marked an end to the century of humiliation when China finally forced a Western power to withdraw. In China, the Korean War is known as the War to Resist America and Aid Korea. After the Korean War, Chairman Mao started to transform the country in accordance to his communist ideals. He decided to further land reform by abolishing all private land ownership and forced the farmers to move to communes and collectives. In 1958, he launched a great leap forward in an effort to improve industrial production. The whole country was mobilized, and crude furnaces were set up to produce low-quality, almost useless steel. Farms were deserted, and the country went into a great famine, and more than 20 million people died as a direct result of this reckless policy. Mao was heavily criticized within the party and ceded control. However, in an effort to re-seize power, he launched a cultural revolution in 1966, which encouraged students to form the Red Guards and rebel against all authorities. Riots broke out across the country, and tens of thousands of intellectuals and officials were purged or killed. By developing a cult of personality, Mao Zedong successfully managed the Red Guards and made them believe that their actions were efforts to protect Chairman Mao and communism from the right-wing capitalists. The Red Guards also damaged many ancient cultural relics which they claimed were remnants of China's imperial past. The Cultural Revolution, which lasted 10 years until Mao's death in 1976, was a major socio-economic and cultural blow to China. Traditional values were destroyed and social distrust grew as people reported each other. It has remained a taboo today, and discussions strictly followed the Chinese Communist Party's interpretation, which asserted that it was an error and does not undermine the greatness of Chairman Mao. After Mao's death and decades of chaos brought by him, Deng Xiaoping came to power. A pragmatic man who struggled hard to manage the country during Mao's revolution, he launched a policy of reform and opening up. By downplaying communist thoughts and opening the country to the West, the public gradually cooled down in political movements and focused more on the economy. He set up many economic zones to attract investments from Hong Kong and Taiwan, among them Shenzhen, which was originally a small village beside Hong Kong, soon turned to be a major industrial hub. China gradually grew economically under Deng's rule, and in less than 4 decades, the once impoverished country has become the second largest economy in the world. During the 1980s, when China was opening up, many communist economic settings were interrupted. The people who had lived for 3 decades under planned economy was not prepared for a free market. Essentials like food and other commodities started to experience inflation, while salaries still stayed fixed, as most people were still employed by the states. Some officials who took advantage of the loosening restrictions became corrupt, and there was great panic and anger among the people towards the government. College students also started to protest as they saw this reform policy as an opportunity to push for democracy. These discontent gradually grew until the spring of 1989, when millions of students and workers across the country gathered at Tiananmen Square in Beijing to demand faster political reform. The Communist Party was shocked to see so many people protesting and feared that this may turn into revolution and decided to call in the military to crack down on the protesters. On June 4, tanks rode into the streets of Beijing and hundreds or thousands of people were killed. The Tiananmen Square incident, or known as June 4th incident in China, was considered a watershed event in Chinese politics. It is today one of the most sensitive subjects in PRC and sets the limit of political protest in China up to this day. To many people, the massacre of June 4th showed how ruthless the Chinese Communist Party can be on political dissidents, and many people learned to focus only on economic growth while staying silent on politics. China's economy grew exponentially after the Tiananmen incident, especially in the 21st century when China was admitted into the WTO. As its economy and military might overshadow its neighbors, it is no longer regarded as the poor ancient country in the East. To many, it is expected that China will eventually surpass the US to be the most powerful nation in the world. However, despite the advances in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, China as a whole is still a developing country. Its 1.4 billion population meant that on average, a Chinese person may still be a farmer boy who recently moved to the city to work in a factory on minimum wages. The country still has a long way to go, especially politically, where the Chinese Communist Party is still firmly in power, censoring its people and assimilating minorities. As we're now on the verge of a new Cold War between the US and China, it is important to know China's history in order to understand Chinese mentality. Chinese people have long been used to being the dominant power in the region. This led to China's belief and confidence in its culture and system. However, the recent stumble to the West and Japan was a devastating blow the Chinese find hard to get used to. This humiliation, coupled with the urge to regain its past prestige, resulted in the rise of nationalism which the KMT and the CCP comfortably ride on. As the government actively educates its people through nationalistic propaganda, it is cemented inside people's mind as a greater cause which can override individual. In a sense, the Chinese dream proposed by Xi Jinping is not so much different from a crusade or jihad. It justifies authoritarian rule and also unification of all former territory, such as Hong Kong and Taiwan. China is a great country with rich culture and long history, but this form of victimizing oneself to boost nationalism is not beneficial at all to China. It only serves to alienate the country with its neighbors and also polarizes the population into arrogant and irrational wolf warriors who sometimes even the Communist Party find hard to control. What would become of China? Would it re-establish a new world order and take America's place? Or would it collapse like the Soviet Union? No one knows. But there is one thing for sure. It would be stupid to underestimate a country, and even more so to not understand the Chinese mentality.